introduction, and then my two colleagues will brief the Council. Excellencies, 2 days ago, in this very chamber, I made a direct appeal: give peace a chance. That call was not heeded. Instead, the bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities by the United States marks a perilous turn in a region that is already reeling. From the outset of the crisis, I have repeatedly condemned any military escalation in the Middle East. The people of the region cannot endure another cycle of destruction. And yet, we now risk descending into a rat hole of retaliation after retaliation. To avoid it, diplomacy must prevail. Civilians must be protected. Safe maritime navigation must be guaranteed. We must act immediately and decisively to halt the fighting and return to serious, sustained negotiations on the Iran nuclear program. We need a credible, comprehensive and verifiable solution, one that restores trust, including with full access to inspectors of the IAEA as the United Nations technical authority in this field. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is a cornerstone of international peace and security. Iran must fully respect it. And all member states must act in accordance with their obligations under the UN Charter and other rules of international law, including international.
I want to just quickly give some context as to what he's talking about. So he is condemning the actions of the United States, but he's also not letting Iran completely off the hook either. Now, there are international inspections that Iran has signed up to be a part of, to be audited, to make sure that their nuclear facilities are only being used to research and develop the creation of nuclear energy and not nuclear bombs. Now, recently, those inspections have been drastically limited by Iran, which has further degraded the trust that the U.S. and the United Nations has in Iran when it comes to not developing nuclear weapons. So although the Secretary General of the United Nations is condemning the United States for bombing Iran, they're also condemning Iran for not being completely transparent either. I just wanted to give some context there.
International humanitarian law. The United Nations stands ready to support any and all efforts toward a peaceful resolution. But peace cannot be imposed. It must be chosen. Madam President, we face a stark choice. One path leads to wider war, deeper human suffering, and serious damage to the international order. The other leads to de-escalation, diplomacy, and dialogue. We know which path is right, and I urge this Council and all Member States to act with reason, restraint, and urgency. We cannot and must not give up on peace. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his remarks, and I now give the floor to Ms. Miroslav Jenča.
Madam President, on the evening of 21 June, the President of the United States announced that the U.S. military conducted strikes against the Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan nuclear facilities in Iran. Shortly thereafter, the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran confirmed that the attacks around the nuclear sites had taken place. Iranian state media indicated the 3 sites had been evacuated and the highly enriched uranium stockpile transferred in advance. Iran has said there were no immediate signs of radioactive contamination at the 3 locations following the strikes. The Crisis Management Bureau of COM, where Fordow is located, stated that the perimeter of the Fordow nuclear site had been targeted. Iranian state media said only 2 tunnels for entry and exit were destroyed at Fordow. Preliminary open-source satellite imagery shows damage at various points at the facility. I urge Iran to allow IAEA inspectors access to the sites to conduct damage assessments as soon as safety conditions allow. I also note that this Council will shortly hear from IAEA Director General Grossi. The latest development must be viewed with the utmost seriousness. It marks a dangerous escalation in a conflict that has already devastated many lives in both countries, in a region on the edge. It is a direct threat to international peace and security. Madam President, Under-Secretary General Di Carlo told this Council only 2 days ago that we were teetering on the edge of a full-blown conflict. I fear we are now in that dangerous moment. Meanwhile, the hostilities between Israel and Iran continue and are now in their 10th day. Hours after the US strikes, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, said it had launched some 14 missiles at Israel. Israeli authorities reported that more than 85 people were injured in the barrage, and numerous structures in Tel Aviv and its southern suburbs sustained heavy damage, including many residential buildings and an elder care home. Israel also said it had launched a series of strikes against military targets in Iran, including in Tehran, Tabriz, and Yazd. The Israel Defense Forces, IDF, said 30 fighter jets had struck dozens of military targets across Iran. Iranian media reported several civilian fatalities, including children, and damage to homes and other civilian infrastructure. Earlier, on 21st June, Israel attacked for a second time since 13 June the Isfahan nuclear complex, hitting 6 buildings. According to Iran's Ministry of Health, as of 21st June, 430 people have been killed and more than 3,500 others injured due to Israeli strikes
of enriched uranium at 60%. Any agreement, ladies and gentlemen, the Middle East need peace. Madam President, I would like to thank the Secretary General for his permanent
I also quickly just want to summarize what the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations just said. He said that thus far, thankfully, there are no signs of nuclear contamination. There were only 2 tunnels to enter and exit to the Fordo facility, and both have been destroyed, which has been confirmed by Iran. The Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations also went on to urge international damage assessments to be able to be allowed in Iran to ensure that there are, in fact, no nuclear contaminations, which, of course, would be devastating.
Support to the IAEA and myself in the discharge of my duties. I also like to thank the Assistant Secretary General for his intervention right now. I have convened a special session of the Board of Governors of the IAEA tomorrow morning in Vienna to continue the consideration of this issue that this body has started today, or has continued today, rather. Secretary General, Madam President, dear permanent representatives, colleagues, the nuclear non-proliferation regime that has underpinned international security for more than half a century is on the line. The dramatic events in Iran have become even more serious with last night's bombardments and the potential widening of the conflict. We have a window of opportunity to return to dialogue and diplomacy. If that window closes, violence and destruction could reach unthinkable levels, and the global non-proliferation regime, as we know it, could crumble and fall. Iran, Israel, Iran, the Middle East need peace, and there is a path for diplomacy. We must return, as the Secretary General just said, to the negotiating table and allow the IAEA inspectors, the guardians of the NPT, to go back to Iran's nuclear sites and account for the stockpiles of uranium, including, most importantly, the 4,400 kilograms of enriched uranium at 60%. Any agreement, ladies and gentlemen, any arrangement will have as a prerequisite the establishment of the facts on the ground. This can be done only through IAEA inspections. IAEA inspectors are in Iran, and they must do their job. This will require a cessation of hostilities so that Iran can let the teams into the sites under the necessary safety and security conditions.
Okay, so again, just to give context here, what he's mainly focusing on is the fact that there are international audits that Iran has agreed to have their nuclear facilities inspected to create transparency and ensure to the United Nations that they're not, in fact, developing nuclear weapons. Now, obviously, most people think that recently Iran has not been allowing these inspections or not allowing them to the fullest extent because they are, in fact, developing these weapons. And this is what the United Nations is saying, that yes, they're condemning what the U.S. is doing, but again, they're urging Iran to allow these inspections as well, and they're urging for diplomacy and peace, right? They're basically telling Iran, let these inspections resume, U.S. de-escalate, but at the same time, the United States, on the other hand, is asking for a complete capitulation of Iran, a complete, bowing down here. And it sounds like Iran, although they might be open to the inspections, they kind of want to have it both ways. They want to have the inspections, but at the same time, they want to limit these inspections, which breaks that trust and really doesn't create the transparency needed to ensure the United Nations knows that Iran, in fact, is not developing these weapons.
Special measures by Iran to protect its nuclear materials and equipment can be done in accordance with Iran's safeguards obligations with the agency. Let us not allow the window to close on diplomacy. Let us not allow the non-proliferation regime to fail. Irrespective of individual positions and views, one thing is certain, and this is the simple truth: we will not be safer if there are more nuclear weapons in more states around the world. The IAEA is ready to do its part to bring this military confrontation.
Okay, so he just said we will not be safer as a world, as a global population, if more people develop nuclear weapons. And this is where things get a little complicated, right? Because myself being an American, having the privilege of being an American, we enjoy that privilege of having the strongest military, having the most nuclear weapons. Then you have countries like Iran, where although personally, we don't want anyone to have nuclear weapons. We don't trust anyone with that type of power. From their perspective, we have nuclear weapons. It's rumored that Israel has nuclear weapons. So just put yourself in the footsteps of someone who is from Iran, right? They just got bullied. And again, I'm not defending them. I just want to show you this is how war escalates, right? Both sides think they're right. Now, from the Iranians' perspective, they just got bombed because we don't want them to have nuclear weapons. Now, the reason the U.S. is able to bomb them with authority without real fears of massive retaliation, they could retaliate, right? But they don't have nuclear weapons. Now, if they had the nuclear weapons already, the U.S. might not even have attacked in the first place because we know they already had those and they could retaliate, right? And this is where the Iranian argument comes in, where they say, well, we don't want nukes to destroy you. We want nukes to defend ourselves, right? Because the best defense is offense. If you have these nukes, you're less likely to get attacked. Again, not defending them, just telling you this is why in war both sides always think they're right and things continue to escalate. And the UN is essentially condemning the United States for escalating things because, let's be clear here, even if you think Trump did the right thing and you think, that Iran is a threat and they're on the verge of creating these weapons and they need to be stopped, the U.S. did escalate things, and the United Nations is condemning that. At the same time, they're condemning Iran for not being transparent with their nuclear facilities and allowing inspections. That way we can know for certain they're not creating nuclear weapons.
To an end. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Grossi for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who may wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I'd like to express my appreciation to Guyana, Presidency of the Security Council, for promptly convening today's meeting at this increasingly precarious moment. I thank the Secretary General for his powerful statement. I also appreciate IAEA Director General Grossi and ASG Yencha for their informative briefings. In just over a week, this Council has met 3 times, yet regrettably, each session has witnessed a further escalation of tensions. The Republic of Korea reiterates its profound concern over the deteriorating situation in the Middle East and expresses its sincere hope for urgent de-escalation. When we gathered last Friday, we voiced our hope that a renewed opening for diplomacy might emerge. It is lamentable that in a matter of only 2 days, that hope now seems even more distant than before. Despite the deeply concerning developments in recent days, the Republic of Korea remains firmly convinced that no sustainable resolution to this crisis can be achieved through military means alone. Indeed, now more than ever, we implore all parties to recognize that diplomacy is not merely an option, but an urgent necessity. We call on all sides to exercise maximum restraint and to commit in earnest to restoring dialogue and engaging in
Okay, so Korea essentially urging de-escalation as well and saying that militaries alone will not solve the issue. Let's fast forward a little bit, see what the other countries are saying.
Catastrophic consequences for civilians, the region, and the world, end of quote. While guided by our earlier interventions at meetings held on the 13th and 20th June on this situation, the alarming developments compel this Council to act with urgency. We are concerned to note that less than 24 hours ago,
all right, let's see what the UK is saying.
Representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you for convening this meeting. I'd like to start by thanking the Secretary-General, ASG Yencha, and DG Grossi for briefing us today. This is a pivotal moment for the region. A further spiral of conflict poses serious risks to regional and international peace and stability. Our foremost priority must now be to support de-escalation. We have long made clear that Iran must not have a nuclear weapon and that their nuclear program represents a serious threat to international peace and security. The United States took action last night to alleviate that threat. The United Kingdom did not participate in US or Israeli strikes. But military action alone cannot bring a durable solution to concerns about Iran's nuclear program. My Prime Minister has been clear. We urge Iran now to show restraint, and we urge all parties to return to the negotiating table and find a diplomatic solution which stops further escalation and brings this crisis to an end. It is in the interests of all parties to pursue such a deal. It is in the interests of all parties to pursue such a deal. This was the joint call made by my Prime Minister with his French and German crisis to an end.
Look at that shot there with Iran sitting right next to the UK. So essentially the United Kingdom kind of saying what everyone else is saying here at this meeting, calling for a de-escalation, also firmly reiterating that Iran should not develop any nuclear weapons, and really acknowledging the fact that Iran has not been transparent with their nuclear facilities. Again, that is one of the biggest things at the center of this whole conflict. Iran, many years ago, agreed to having their facilities audited by international auditors. Recently, they have not been allowing this. They're not having transparency. And the UN is acknowledging this as well, right? They're acknowledging that Iran is probably trying to create nuclear weapons, right? So they're kind of holding both sides accountable to a certain extent. You could see the representative from Iran sitting right next to the woman from the UK. He does not look happy. I mean, in his eyes, think about it. Your country just got bombed. He's completely pissed. But guys, I want to summarize what exactly is happening here. Like, what is the United Nations? What are the procedures at play here? What power do they actually have to keep anybody accountable? What can they do to Iran? What can they do to the United States? What power does the United States have at the table here at the United Nations? So let's quickly summarize this. So Iran is a member of the United Nations, and the purpose of the United Nations is multiple. One, to maintain international peace and security. Two, develop friendly relations amongst nations, cooperate on solving global problems, economic, social, humanitarian, culture, and health-related issues globally to make the world a better place in general. Promote and encourage respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and just to generally be a center of harmonizing the actions of nations toward all of these goals, right? Now, the United Nations is essentially saying that they are gravely alarmed by the U.S. force against Iran with these bombings, and they are calling for a massive de-escalation. At the same time, they are condemning Iran for not being transparent with their nuclear facilities, which again, they promised they were only going to develop nuclear for energy. They're not being transparent, and obviously it looks like they're on the brink of developing nuclear weapons. Now, what power does the United Nations have to hold either country accountable? Because one thing I want to talk about is the United States actually has veto power when it comes to most of these things. So check this out. Now, sorry, one sec here. Let me pull up my notes. Now, they're having this emergency meeting. It's a 15-member council, including the United States, Russia, China, the UK, and France. These 5 countries have veto power. So the majority of things that this council tries to do can be vetoed, even if just one of these countries vetoes it. So if they try and hold the U.S. accountable and the U.S. vetoes it, it's done. Russia, China, UK, and France have the exact same power. Now, one thing they could potentially do is seek sanctions against either Iran or the United States. They could also demand a ceasefire. They could urge peacekeeping deployments, which is essentially what they're doing. And they could also put this into international court if Iran wants to charge the United States with a war crime, essentially. However, the United States has veto power, which often blocks any formal condemnation or punitive measures against American actions. So let's take a look at this and see how this works. Let's take a look here. So what happens if the UN Security Council is deadlocked? The Security Council can condemn the United States and try and put in place economic sanctions, but again, the US can veto this. They can also essentially do a non-binding condemnation, which is kind of what they're doing here gently. They're condemning the United States. They've literally said they condemn the United States' actions, but those don't really have any legal ramifications, right? This is just really a slap on the wrist, is really all they can do, right? And let's talk about how these vetoes actually came to be. Now, the veto power comes from the United Nations Charter, specifically Article 27, which gives 5 countries permanent seats on the Security Council. They call these countries the P5. Now, this includes the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France. Now, these 5 countries were the main victors of World War II, And because of this, they demanded special privileges to ensure that they would never be overruled in this council. Now, the deal was these 5 countries, again, the United States, Russia, China, the UK, and France, would join and support the United Nations, but only if each individual country got complete veto power over major decisions. So what exactly can the United States veto? Now, the veto applies to major matters in the Security Council, such as what they're addressing today. Now, resolutions, if they want to condemn the United States officially, they can do so informally, but formally they can't do so because the U.S. can veto that. If they want to impose economic or military sanctions, the U.S. could veto that as well. Again, Iran does not have any of these privileges. It's just the U.S. and these other 4 countries that do. If they want to authorize any kind of force, military force, or military peacekeeping actions, again, the U.S. could veto that as well, but that would never happen against the U.S., honestly, not at this point. They could also send these cases to the International Criminal Court. Again, the U.S. could veto that as well. So really, Iran would be on their own going to like international court for this. They wouldn't be able to go through the UN because the U.S., again, could veto that as well. And membership decisions, recommending new UN members, the U.S. could veto that as well. So essentially, any 5 of these countries, including the U.S., could veto basically anything. So really, it's kind of interesting. The UN is basically powerless, to be honest with you. The U.S., with these 5 other countries, again, that is the U.S., Russia, China, UK, and France, they can basically veto almost anything the UN tries to do. Let's take a look and see what they say.
It is in the interests of all parties to pursue such a deal. This was the joint call made by my Prime Minister with his French and German counterparts earlier today. Together with our E3 partners, the UK has long pursued a diplomatic solution to address Iran's nuclear escalation. On Friday, alongside E3 and EU colleagues, my Foreign Secretary met Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi in Geneva to press directly for a return to diplomacy. My Foreign Minister spoke to Foreign Minister Araghchi again today and stressed the urgency of this, and we continue to engage partners across the region. President, the UK reiterates its full support for the IAEA and Director General Grossi for their critical work, professionalism and impartiality. The IAEA and the Non-Proliferation Treaty are key pillars of international security. Threats against IAEA staff and the DG are unacceptable. We urge Iran to cooperate fully with the IAEA. Failure to do so will only further fuel escalation. President, now is the time
Again, those are the inspections the UN agreed to on their facilities.
for de-escalation and a return to diplomacy. It is essential
that there will be consequences.
China.
Thank you, President.
Okay, let's see what China's saying.
I thank you for convening this emergency open meeting. I also thank Secretary General Guterres for his statement, and ASD Yenta and Director General Grossi for their briefings. Yesterday, the United States conducted the strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities in Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. China strongly condemns the U.S. attacks on Iran and the bombing of nuclear facilities under the safeguards of the IAEA. The actions of the United States seriously violate the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and international law, as well as Iran's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity. It has exacerbated tensions in the Middle East and dealt a heavy blow to the international nuclear non-proliferation regime. The international community must uphold justice and make concrete efforts to cool down the situation and restore peace and stability. In this connection, I wish to put forward 4 appeals. First, we call for an immediate ceasefire and ending the hostilities. In the context of the abrupt escalation of tensions in the Middle East, China is deeply concerned about the risk of the situation getting out of control. The parties to the conflict, Israel in particular, should reach an immediate ceasefire to prevent a spiraling escalation. and to resolutely avoid the spillover of the war. The parties concerned should abide by international law, curb the impulse to use force, and avoid exacerbating conflicts and adding fuel to the fire. Second, we call for effective protection of civilians. The ultimate victims of all conflicts are the innocent people. China is deeply saddened by the large number of civilian casualties caused by the conflict. Civilians and civilian facilities must not become targets of military operations. And the bottom line of international humanitarian law must not be breached. Parties to the conflict should place the interests and well-being of the people of the countries in the region above everything else, and make every effort to avoid harm to innocent civilians and refrain from attacking civilian facilities. Third, we call for commitment to dialogue and negotiation. Peace in the Middle East cannot be achieved by the use of force. Dialogue and negotiation are the fundamental way out. At present, diplomatic means to address the Iranian nuclear issue haven't been exhausted, and there's still hope for a peaceful solution. Parties should stay firmly committed to the political settlement of the Iranian nuclear issue and work to bring it back onto the track of a political solution through dialogue and negotiation, with a view to reaching an agreement acceptable to all parties. Fourth, we call for swift actions by the Security Council. The Security Council has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, and cannot stand idly by in the face of a major crisis. Russia, China, and Pakistan have proposed a draft resolution calling for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, the protection of civilians, respect for international law, and engaging in dialogue and negotiation. We hope that Council members can demonstrate their strong sense of responsibility by jointly supporting the draft resolution to enable the Security Council to fulfill its responsibilities for the maintenance of international peace and security. China stands ready to work with the international community to foster synergy, uphold justice, and make unremitting efforts to restore peace.
Okay, guys, so just to summarize what China is saying, China is calling for an immediate ceasefire. This is their suggestion. They have four things here: ceasefire, protect civilians, utilizing a dialogue here in diplomacy versus military force, and then they're urging the UN to take swift actions here with the Security Council to enforce peace and security. Again, reiterating that not only them, but most of these countries here are hoping for a ceasefire. Again, the problem is the United States has vetoing power, so them calling for a ceasefire, they cannot formally do that because the U.S. can veto that, right? The U.S. can basically do whatever they want. They have so much power within the United Nations Council. Now, at the crux of this entire meeting is the fact that most of them are saying that the United States did not really, in fact, act in self-defense. They were the aggressor here. The United States says that, yes, they're acting in self-defense because Iran is on the brink of creating nuclear weapons, so they're using offense as defense, if that makes sense. Then they're also slapping Iran on the wrist for not complying with the inspections that they agreed to be audited, to have their nuclear facilities audited as well, because Iran did agree to not develop nuclear weapons. So both sides essentially getting a little bit of a slap in the wrist here. It's kind of a crazy thing to see when bombs are being dropped and missiles are being shot at these countries. And then you have these representatives just sitting in their suits comfortably, essentially slapping themselves on the wrist. The United States has all the power. The United Nations, they could try and, put a legal stamp on a ceasefire saying the United States has to ceasefire. The United States can veto it, so they don't actually have to comply with that. They could say to the United States, we're going to impose sanctions on you if you don't comply. The United States can veto that as well. So it's really incredible the amount of power that the U.S. has within the United Nations. Essentially, when you're big enough like the U.S. is, you really hold all the cards. But the one worry here is just kind of foreign relations, right? We already have Trump imposing tariffs. He kind of pissed a lot of countries off doing that. They're still trying to work out those tariffs. Now we have the U.S. being pretty aggressive here. Even if you agree with the aggression, it is very aggressive. Other countries don't like seeing that, right? We don't like seeing other countries bombing people. Other countries don't like seeing us do that as well. So, guys, it's going to be really interesting to see if the United Nations tries to enforce something, obviously the U.S. would veto that. But if they do, it's kind of going to be a signal as to where the relations lie between the U.S. and the other countries in all of this. It's going to be interesting to see how Iran retaliates. They've already shot missiles at Israel today. Some people are worried that Iran is going to attack U.S. military bases in the Middle East as well. And then it's going to be interesting to see if Iran actually meets with the U.S. to try and start a dialogue again. Interestingly enough, Marco Rubio and Trump, they're actually saying, hey, you know what? Now let's meet. Let's talk peace. Let's figure this out. Despite the fact that they just bombed Iran yesterday. It's pretty incredible, right? Obviously, Iran's probably not in the mood to negotiate. If Iran could have it their way, they'd probably be bombing U.S. bases as much as they could. They'd probably be bombing, U.S. soil if they could, right? So, guys, there's a lot of updates coming daily. Please like this video. Please subscribe if you like these updates. This stuff's terrible. We don't want to see war. We don't want to see, people getting bombed. But at the same time, we don't want people developing nuclear weapons either. So I will keep you posted as things develop. Again, please like, please subscribe. Appreciate you guys being here. Stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next video.